Crazy Stupid Podcast.
If you'd like to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to know whenever we post, we would really, really appreciate this. Because as we say every week, we are the most important thing in your life. So we've also decided to rewatch Andor. My God.
It's just so good.
My God.
We start off on, it's called Morlana 1, where we start that planet, right? My first thought was that it seems like it's over-policed but under-protected in the same way that like many Black communities and communities of color in the United States are. And that there's like a heavy police presence, but it's actually not there to protect the people living there. They're there to protect their own interests. And so you can kind of tell, like, when they follow him out, like, they're really big on, like, petty little things, like, where did you park your, I said car, whatever, shit. Where did you park your vehicle? Do you have this certain ID? Like, they are over-policing in that aspect, and that they're, like, trying to get people for all these little petty things. And then, of course, they're also being unethical and bribing people and doing all this kind of stuff. But you can tell just by these couple minutes that we were there that there's a whole bunch of shady shit going on there, like some real shady things happening there, right? And it's like, you just, in those environments, like, there are definitely people who are being exploited, right? Like, there's definitely lots of other things going on, but these cops don't seem to be at all concerned with that. So it just reminded me of that, of like what it sort of represents, in that, like, there's just communities like that exist all over the place, where like it's essentially like lawless, not because there's not the presence of law enforcement, but because law enforcement isn't protecting anybody there from actually being harmed. The only time that things really kick into high gear and people actually start to take things seriously is when two of the officers are killed. And even then, not really. Like, they were going to try to sweep that under the rug, right? That officer who suddenly is all in high gear trying to, like, we have to handle this, it's a crime, this is human life. You were not concerned about this planet or the people there before this.
I've got thoughts on that too. It looked like we picked up on the same thing.
Like, you didn't care.
Where you ended was where I kind of kept going in my mind. So in these first two episodes of Andor, it really feels like they are critiquing that thin blue line that happens in the police force. When that main officer who we are introduced to in these first two episodes, when he finds out that they lose two officers, that's the only thing that he cares about. He doesn't care about the list of unethical actions and crimes that those two officers were committing. His ranking officer is literally telling him, like, they were involved in this, they were involved in this, and these things were clearly breaking our own rules. None of that really mattered. It didn't matter to him that the area that they were not supposed to be in was a place that clearly isn't protected, was a place where officers are clearly doing illegal things. When he tries to present himself as like a law-abiding officer, you can see how he doesn't even recognize the contradiction of his morals, because all of that stuff that was unethical didn't matter because the line, that thin blue line, had been broken. This was one of those moments where Star Wars really hit their point home on something. Like, truly, where I felt the weight of, you knew that there were moments in Star Wars planets where things were kind of sketchy, but I don't think I've ever observed to this degree, how they are not going to place all of the criticism of lawlessness on the civilians. They're placing it on the Empire and their policing. That I thought was a very intentional, and it was a very effective message.
Very effective. And it's also very important because this is how, like, quote unquote lawlessness functions in reality. To us, looking at him and the way that he's looking at this is like, you are saying that you care a lot about the law and morals and ethics, but you didn't care about any of these people until they harmed one of your own, right? That looks contradictory to us. The way that the law functions is that there are certain people for whom it is impossible to commit a crime against them. Not because it's impossible for them to be harmed, but because it's not considered criminal when you harm them. Like, in America, it's not considered criminal when you harm Black people. That's why nobody's coming and checking for, like, Black people who are the victims of crimes.
Yeah.
And it's always been like that. That's a legacy of slavery. And that legacy has just carried on and it continues. It's the same thing when we're talking about like people at the border and all the crazy shit that's happening down there. It's the same thing. Like the law simply doesn't protect everybody. It's just designed to not take into account the suffering of certain groups of people and to not protect them against harm, no matter who the harm is coming from, whether it's one of their own or whether it's the state, whoever it is. It's not. So lawlessness is literally born out of that environment.
Yep.
The reason why it's so clear in Andor, part of it is because of the casting. We kind of talked about this briefly before, but like when you're trying to make a point like this, it's very important that you have people of color in the show. So like when they say man with dark features, that's like how they describe him. I literally had to sit there and think like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like it's very specific language, but at the same time, it's extremely broad. Like what are dark features? What is that? I remember growing up as a kid sitting and listening to my dad talk to like his other Black men friends of around the same age. And they would literally just swap like casual stories of like, oh yeah, I remember one time I got pulled over because they were looking for a Black male. And they pull me over just because it's the exact same thing. It's like
white t-shirt, blue jeans.
Right. Like it's like the language is very broad. It's broad enough that it could be anybody in a certain subsect of people, but it's specific enough that it excludes a certain group of people too.
Yes.
Same thing with this, like dark features, what is that? But at the same time, you know what it is, you know?
That kind of leads into my second point. And I've been really trying to explore this idea of why do fans somehow recently think that Star Wars has gotten too political and woke? And I do think on one hand, you can look at that and say, you know, like there's some media illiteracy there, like they weren't paying attention. But I think there's a little bit more to it that I think is worth exploring. I think the reason why a lot of Star Wars fans think that Star Wars has recently gotten political and woke is that the veil that they could hide their values and worldviews behind can't really exist anymore. That I think that's the reality of where we're at. Because whether you got the point of the original Star Wars or not, many of us did, but clearly a lot of people either one saw the Empire as just a sort of Disney caricature idea of empire, just something bad.
Yeah.
Or you didn't allow real critical thinking skills to kick in. And so you sort of projected your own worldview of what you think the empire could potentially look like based off of your own politics. I think what we've seen Star Wars do in the last several years is to say, we're going to add more depth to what the empire is and how it became an empire and how it maintained its oppressive behaviors and its oppressive structures. And the way you do that, particularly in our modern world, is you have to honestly share what an empire is and what it looks like in our modern day lifetime.
Yeah.
And I think once Star Wars started to do that, it felt like an indictment on a lot of right-leaning people. It felt like an indictment on their values. And to them, they think that's too political. And that, I think, is my concern with a lot of those type of fans. Instead of pausing for a second to see why your favorite piece of literature is critiquing your worldview, you simply say that they've gone too woke or they've gone too political. Or they take the route and they will blame like people on the other end as being the empire, like the progressives, the woke mob, the communists. And whenever they say things like that, I truly feel like you don't have a deep fundamental understanding of how oppression has worked in our country for decades. The work of diversity and inclusion and anti-racism in schools is not a form of oppression, but in their mind, because it's something that they don't like, they equate that to the same suffering that marginalized communities have had, and then AKA empire. And it shows that, like, for a lot of you all, this is the first time it's been impossible for you to hide behind the veil of just escapism with Star Wars, and you're really hit with what feels like for you a whiplash of politics. And so with Andor, it's right in front of your face. You can't really hide it. And even in some of the other animated shows, there are moments in Clone Wars and in Rebels where they touch on some of those themes. It may not be as serious as they did with Andor, but it's there, it's present. More conversation should be had about that. It's not just the fact that did Star Wars get political and did it not? And did you just miss it? I think a more effective conversation is you just weren't willing to expand your worldview. And so you're disappointed that your favorite literature is critiquing something that's like core to your identity.
I think they're just making the point better now than they ever have. Because even me, I mean, and I watched these as a kid, but so that is definitely part of it. But even me, it wasn't until I was an adult that I like really understood what the story was about. I don't know who's all the names of people that are behind Andor, but I'd be willing to bet that they've diversified like who it is that's like show running this and like the directors and stuff. I'd be willing to bet that there's like more people of color involved, probably more women involved, because I just think like
even if they're not writers, they clearly did their research.
Yeah, like you're like, I'm gonna tell a story about imperialism, but then you zoomed in and hyper focused on this one family of white people to try to tell the story, and it's distracting. It takes away from the larger point because we're so focused on this small group of people, and it's, you know, there's lots of like lore and like mysticism and stuff involved too that can all be there. It can all be there. It's fine, but I feel like they spent so much of the series energy focusing there and less on like what would actually be the impacts of what's happening with this group of people on the rest of the galaxy. If you want to make the point, you have to make the point from the perspective of the people most harmed. That wasn't Luke, Leia, and Han. You just didn't go there, in my opinion, for a lot of the franchise. And I just think that's a blind spot. I think we see it over and over and over again with these sci-fi fantasy stories that are written by white men. I think over and over again, we just see it where it's like, yes, with an analytical eye, I can see exactly what you're saying and what you're getting at, but it's just not clear enough and it's not centered enough because you just missed it by a little. Like you just didn't put your focus in the right place. You didn't angle the story correctly. So there was just so much other stuff people to focus on. It's not that hard. It's really not that hard to watch Star Wars and just be like, fun story about,
because that's what a lot of people did,
taking over evil.
That's what a lot of fans did.
It's pretty easy to do that, and that's because of how the story is told.
Yeah, versus now you can't avoid it.
Yeah,
it's too in your face. It's too distracting to just escape.
And also it's not just a like good versus evil. That's not what they're doing with this. They're not showing a good versus evil story. They're showing a small group of people taking on a system, like a system of power. That's different. When the whole thing is like the light, the force, the good, the dark and the light, and it feels equal. But the truth is that this is not an equal fight. This is a fight of people who are the subjects of an oppressive system fighting against the oppressive system. It's not. We're not playing like this. We're not on equal playing fields here. That's not what this is.
Yeah.
Sometimes I worry with some of these writers and creators. Sometimes I worry that the oppressive system is just like an interesting backdrop for like the story that they really want to tell. Like it can feel like that sometimes of like.
Maybe with Star Wars. I wouldn't say that with Dune though.
No, I genuinely don't know enough about Dune
to
say that. I'm just saying, like, it can just feel like that sometimes of, like, yeah, it's there, like, it's happening in the background, and it adds a little something. It gives it a little oomph, but like really like you like the lightsabers and you like
the lore building.
Which is cool. All of that is cool.
Well, I hear you.
Yeah.
I think that's where I kind of have to give Dave Filoni some credit with what he was able to explore in Clone Wars and in Rebels, and even to a degree with Bad Batch. I know we haven't watched that. I watched the first season. I haven't really watched the second one, but the concepts that they explore there, it wasn't just that, for me, it wasn't just that it filled the plot holes of the prequels. It added validity to the message that they wanted to get across a lot clearer. Mm-hmm. So I don't think you're wrong. And I don't know, I think maybe Dave saw it maybe more from our perspective, and there's still a lot of lore building in a lot of his shows, but you see more of you see more Empire, you know. I think the tone in Andor is just a little bit darker, but I think not to say that like Filoni's like, let me go and fix what George Lucas did. I think his motive and objective aligned more with maybe what you and I wanted.
Yeah.
I think that's probably what I would say. But I think you're spot on with that. Mm. I'd agree.
I gotta talk for 1 second about her little boyfriend.
Oh man, that dude was an op from jump, and he was super jelly, bro. Like, listen, if you wanted some kind of stable, simple relationship, you picked the wrong girl, bro.
Number one, but number two, even if they were having an affair, do you know how insane it is? How insane it is to call the authorities
Snitches
on somebody
get
because
stitches.
You suspect that they're having an affair with your girlfriend? That's actually crazy.
Wild.
That's such an overblown response. Like, you're throwing him in jail?
It's also like, bro, what did you think was gonna happen once Andor was gone? You thought she was gonna be like, well, there's only one choice now.
Not just that, but like, you also know that the presence of the state and state forces in your town is not going to only affect one person.
It's gonna hurt everyone.
Like, you have to know that. You can't be that dense.
I think he did regret it later on, though, didn't he?
I mean, yeah.
It was still an impulsive decision.
He didn't have really time to really regret it. I think he regretted it when she found out because she was mad.
It was guilt. Last thing that I will say, you kind of remind me a little bit of this is Andor is really showing us that the fight against oppression and oppressive systems is not a pretty and clean one. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And, you know, you see where Andor's from, right? Saul Guerrero is not like, he doesn't have like electability. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Skarsgård's character, same thing. He gives his speech and he's like, I'm essentially giving up pieces of my humanity for a future that I don't even think I'm going to get a chance to see. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, even Han in the originals, not really like a stand-up guy. You know what I mean? And the decisions that a lot of them have to make. You see that in the first scene with Rogue One, what Andor does to one of his informants. It really shows that the fight against these oppressive systems really forces good people to have to make morally questionable decisions. And for people on the outside looking in the real world, seem to not always understand decision makings from marginalized communities. I immediately thought of, remember back in 2020 when we were protesting everywhere and you had a lot of white folk that were like, well, why did they have to protest in the street? Why are they doing this to the buildings? Why are they yada, yada, yada? And it really shows that one, a lot of people don't understand historically the fight against any sort of oppressive structure is not this clean version that will leave you comfortable all the time. Two, normally you're asking that as a bad faith. Mm-hmm, yeah. You're not truly saying there is a better way for us to do this, because if you really meant it, you would have helped in the cause. And I really appreciate the way that Andor and Rogue One, how they were able to really show that this was really messy work, but it wouldn't have gotten done if those people who would have been deemed by society as questionable and they're not clean, they're not electable, it wouldn't have happened. And you do see that a lot when you think about like Black history. We praise a lot of the ones that are clean and electable. Even the story with Rosa Parks. Earlier on, I thought that was just her story. Then you read, and there was another woman that had the same exact story as her, but her reputation wasn't as clean, so she kind of gets forgotten about throughout history. You see it with the Black Panthers. You see it with Malcolm X. You see it with a bunch of people, and even some of the younger activists in our generation, like the ones who really committed their life to it, just kind of get forgotten about. And it just really reminded me, like, man, it wasn't just Jedi, the people that we look to and love. It wasn't just senators. It was people doing work on the ground that will probably get forgotten about. There's going to be a lot of people in the Star Wars lore that probably will never know the sacrifices that Cassian Andor made, that helped. Because what he did in Rogue One with Jalen Erso, in Rogue One, if they don't do that,
it sets up,
we lose.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I appreciate that they're telling the story of essentially activism accurately and more authentically.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. Because I think even the examples in history that we like to praise and that we consider to be clean, quote
weren't
unquote,
really that clean.
I don't think people know what like peaceful protests like really looked like.
No.
Like the sacrifice, like people laid their bodies down on the ground. Like that's what that was. And that's a big ask. That's honestly why a lot of contemporary activists of the time took issue with that, because they were like, you're just asking Black people to lay their bodies down on the line in front of this.
Sacrificial lambs.
It like that in and of itself, you could say is ethically questionable. This stuff with Andor, already we're seeing like the cost of his, and obviously right now he's not like being an activist right now, like whatever, but like he is in rebellion against the Empire, like stealing that artifact, that object, like that is an act of rebellion against the Empire, even if he's not thinking like take them all down, right? But like you see the cost of that on his community, right? Like we know what's gonna happen to old girl later on in the show. Like other people are paying the price for what he is doing now and what he will eventually do later. Like it just is always messy. Also, man, talking about good monologues from this show, that little speech that Andor gives about how you can just walk in, how he Skarsgård's character asks him how did he get the thing, and he's like, you just walk in like you belong there. And he says something, he's like, they're so fat and happy with themselves. Full of themselves. Is that what it was?
Yeah.
They said they're so full of themselves that it doesn't even, like seriously, like it was just, I feel like that, I forgot about that speech because there's just so many others, but that's a really good one. Like it doesn't even cross their minds that we could be a threat because they just, man, that's good. Okay. Also the music in this show, I felt like you, because I was like,
my heart is so warm right now.
The music in the show does such a good job to create the intensity, because when you think about it, in the first two episodes, a lot has happened, but like the bulk of where we're going has not even, like, it hasn't even started, you know?
You want to hear something funny? The composer for Andor also did Succession.
Oh, wow.
That man, Nicholas Britell, that's a good composer right there.
Yeah, because the music is very tense. Like you feel the tension. I think the music is a good it's a big part of why immediately when this show started, I was like, oh, this is about to be different.
Mm-hmm. I know we talked a little bit about this with Ramin Djawadi a while back, but I really need people to recognize the importance of composers for your favorite movies and television shows, because it makes such a difference. Mm-hmm. It changes everything. The emotions that you feel are so enhanced with the music that's working in collaboration with the actors and the cinematography in that scene. Because when Cassian's mom is giving that speech, the music is swelling, it's building up. And so when she finally says, fight the Empire, that release makes you want to jump out of your seat.
No, seriously.
And the actors in the show, they start yelling, and it feels like a real reflection of what you're experiencing in that moment. You don't get that reaction if the music doesn't land.
Yeah.
I need people to understand that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like people see music as like a condiment, like something that you add onto the sandwich, as opposed to this is a limb. This is a body part that is functioning. It is one of your systems, like your nervous system, your digestive system. Like, you cannot function without it. And even in scenes like, even in shows like The Wire, where there is rarely any music happening at all, but what they do at the end, there's always a melody to close out the episode, because they even understand there has to be a way for the viewer to say message received, and you accomplish that with music. Theme songs, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Marvel. Hans Zimmer has like 20 catalogs worth of stuff, so that's a whole other conversation.
He's on Oppenheimer, right?
No, it's Ludwig Göransson. Oh boy, damn. You know it's gonna be heat though.
Okay, because listen, but you know what? You made it for real as a composer when Christopher Nolan doesn't tap Han on the shoulder; it comes to you instead.
Yeah. People need to start mentioning Ludwig in the same conversation. I know it's gonna be a while because Hans Zimmer's got a couple decades. You know, John Williams, he's got a couple decades, but Ludwig he's getting up there.
Yeah.
Because he's been dropping some heat.
He doesn't miss. He's never missed.
Some heat, bro.
I'm very excited for that movie. I saw a trailer do that the other day.
For Oppenheimer?
Yeah.
This is what I think. I think Barbie did such a phenomenal job with their marketing that opening weekend is going to be a win for them. But I think the word of mouth for Oppenheimer, like what happened with Inception, is going to happen where at the end of the theatrical release, no one's going to make more money. I really do think so.
I think a lot of people are planning to see them both. I think for a lot of people, it's two huge films dropping at the same time. Yeah. I mean, they've even named it Barbieheimer.
I saw a tweet that said Barbie releasing on the same day was the best thing for Oppenheimer, because it was like every time you mentioned one, you're mentioning the other.
Yeah, that's true.
You know? Last thing that I'll say, and then I'll pass it over to you if you have anything else. Okay, well, it's fine. So the Bear apparently is at a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes for season 2, and it apparently is like breaking streaming records for Hulu. And it really got me thinking of this. The Bear feels like a win for like people that just love a great storytelling in film and in television, because sometimes with streaming, it can kind of feel like if you aren't a hit in season 1, you've got the chance of being cut.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because what was that show on Netflix? 1899?
Oh, yeah.
High Fidelity? People are mixed feelings, but I even would put Lovecraft in there. There were more stories for even just in these 3 shows I mentioned to tell, but it felt like networks were just like, nah. The benefit that weekly release had before streaming was the word of mouth. And when you had 17 to 24 episodes, that's several months of it being on air, and for people to talk about it the next day at school or at work. And when that's not really happening, it feels like you're placing writers and directors with an unfair expectation.
Because it has to pop off right away, or
right?
Not at all.
So I'm glad people are finally getting around to The Bear, but it is sad that there are other great shows that won't get that opportunity. Yeah. So I feel for those writers and I feel for those directors.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see you all next time. Peace.